Hello and welcome to BYJU'S, your one-stop destination for competitive examinations related news, views and analysis. Last week, we had a discussion on Gilgit-Baltistan issue. The topic for this week is universal basic income. But before we can have a discussion on universal basic income, let me take you to one of the most beautiful places on this earth. Amidst the lakes, rivers, mountains, and the aesthetic beauty of nature is situated Europe's most beautiful country, Switzerland. Switzerland is a country with 4 national languages. This is one of those countries where one can go in any season and enjoy to the best. It's not only the natural beauty for what Switzerland is known for. There are numerous things related to Switzerland that attract people. Swiss watches, music festivals, cheese, and chocolates as well. But the fact is, Switzerland is a much more interesting country than these cliches might imply. For one, they decide on policy by referendums. If 100,000 Swiss sign up to request that there be a vote on a particular reform, the results of the vote are binding on the government. Referendum. The most recent round of referenda included one that was widely watched across the world. The proposal was to guarantee every adult citizen, not only citizens but also long-term residents, 2,500 Swiss francs per month. 2,500 Swiss francs, which is approximately 1.75 lakh rupees. This was universal basic income. That means irrespective of any other earnings they might have, you are guaranteed 2,500 Swiss francs. Let me make it simpler. It's money you are entitled to, whether you are rich or poor, whether or not you have a job that pays you enough to live on. It is what some people call an unconditional transfer. There are no strings attached. You can spend it on beer for your buddies just as you can spend it on milk for your children. It is your money. Swiss people absolutely did not go for it. 3/4 of them voted against. The idea of a universal basic income was rejected by the people. The reasons, of course, varied. Some people were simply against the principle of giving people money for doing nothing. Then there were those who were worried that people will stop working. Why would you clean houses for a living if you have a cushion of 2,500 Swiss francs to live off? Finally, there was a right-wing paranoia that is everywhere these days. The fear of the migrant hordes coming to drink at the Swiss honeypot. There was a fear that if UBI is also for non-citizens, Switzerland would become an attractive destination for migrants. But why are we discussing this? The reasons are many. Just few days back, there was this news that Jammu and Kashmir might become the first state in this country to implement universal basic income. But the most important reason, there's a chapter on universal basic income in this year's economic survey. The title is Universal Basic Income, a Conversation with and Within the Mahatma. It's a time for India to have universal basic income. Debates such as these dominated the TV screens and also consumed huge quantities of ink. In this lecture, let us look at everything that you need to know regarding universal basic income. What is UBI? Why universal basic income? Arguments against universal basic income. And most importantly, is India ready for universal basic income? Here, let's focus on India and the chapter in the economic survey which is titled Universal Basic Income, a Conversation with and Within the Mahatma. Let's begin with the quote of Mahatma Gandhi himself. Mahatma Gandhi says, "I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt or when the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest man whom you may have seen and ask yourself, if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him, will he gain anything by it? Will it restore him to a control over his own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to freedom? Freedom for those who are hungry and starving. Then you will find your doubts and yourself melt away. What was Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of life? Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of life was wiping every tear from every eye. This philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi is based on the principles of universality, unconditionality, and agency. And all these three things are the hallmarks of universal basic income. How many poor people were in India at the time of independence? 70%. Fast forward to 2011, the percentage fell down to about 22. Remarkable progress. But that still means we have not been able to wipe every tear from every eye. There are millions still teary-eyed who have made no progress. That's not their fault. That's the failure of the system. That's the failure of our political class as well as bureaucracy. Pandit Nehru used to say, so long as there are tears and suffering, our job is still not over. This, my dear friends, is relevant even today. 20th century, if you look at it, 20th century was an era where social and political rights dominated the discourse. 21st century may well be an era of universal basic income. What is a just society? A just society needs to guarantee to each individual a minimum income which they can count on. This income should provide them necessary material for life, access to basic goods, and a life of dignity. That's what a just society is all about. The time has come to think of universal basic income for a variety of reasons. Let us look at the case for universal basic income, the arguments in favor of universal basic income. First argument, social justice. There are experts who say UBI is a test of a just and non-exploitative society. Just go through the writings of Tom Paine and John Rawls and understand from their theories of justice. Nearly every theory of justice has argued that a society which fails to guarantee a decent minimum income to all citizens will fail the test of justice. It should be evident to anyone that no society can be just or stable if it does not give all members of the society a stake. So the first argument in favor of universal basic income is the idea of a just society, social justice. Argument number 2, poverty reduction. There are those who argue that universal basic income is the fastest way of reducing poverty. So the argument number 2 in favor is poverty reduction. Argument number 3, agency. What do we mean by agency? Agency is any action or intervention that produces a particular effect. Now see what's happening. Our current welfare system assumes that people cannot take economic decisions relevant to their lives. So the government will decide what's best for the people. The government thinks that if people are poor, we have to provide them food, shelter, and other basic needs. This is a well-intentioned system, no doubt about that. There is also a flaw in such a system. People enter into the trap of poverty due to a variety of factors. Failure of monsoon can be a factor. Fall in the prices of agricultural or horticultural produce can be a factor. Health hazard can be a factor. Therefore, the state is not in a position to decide for people. An unconditional income, such as universal basic income, if given to the people, this will help people to take independent decisions and steps to overcome the reasons that trap them in poverty in the first place. Agency. Give people money and let them decide what is best for them. That means the third argument in favor of universal basic income is agency. Let's look at the fourth argument, employment. If you look at universal basic income, it is an acknowledgement. What sort of acknowledgement? That society's obligation to guarantee a minimum living standard is even more urgent today. Why urgent today? Because we are living in an uncertain employment generation world. Automation, for example. Automation threatens 69% jobs in India. These are not my words. This is a recent World Bank report. What will people do in absence of jobs? They will seek any form of employment, even if the employment is exploitative. That means people won't have any bargaining power. With UBI, with universal basic income, with a guaranteed income provided by the state to the people can search for better jobs, meaningful jobs. or they can make a different use of their talent. That is another argument in favor of universal basic income. Let's look at another argument, administrative efficiency. And this is particularly very important in case of India. Why? There are numerous welfare schemes in this country which have been criticized, mostly for their inefficiencies. These schemes are riddled with misallocation, leakages, and sometimes the poorest and most deserving are left out of the welfare provision. Why? Because the state has to identify the beneficiaries. These beneficiaries who will be eligible to receive welfare benefits. It is here that our bureaucracy plays its role. Reports suggest that the biggest reason for the failure of the state in eradicating poverty is the fact that benefits don't reach the poor. In fact, the most deserving are left out and the well-off co-opt the benefits. There is no identification required for a universal basic income since it is universal. When the trinity, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and Mobile, when this trinity of Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and Mobile is fully adopted in this country, the time would be ripe for a mode of delivery that is administratively very efficient. Let me make it simpler. For example, we have a scheme X for below poverty line people. First step is to identify who are these families. BPL families. That means additional bureaucratic cost to identify the families. Then there are leakages. Then there is duplication as well. Although Aadhaar has reduced these to a large extent, but still that's the problem. That means the state has to bear cost to identify the beneficiaries, then target the beneficiaries, then an additional cost to transfer these benefits. Under universal basic income, these costs are eliminated because the identification problem is solved. Everybody will be entitled to a universal basic income. Let's talk about something else. There are two major in-kind poverty alleviation policies that are currently in operation. PDS and Maganrega, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Both these programs involve large-scale government involvement. Economists like Surjit Balla, they write that only 50% of the food procured and stored by the government reaches anybody, whether rich or poor. Where does the remaining 50% go? Towards the generation of black income for corrupt officials, liquor manufacturers, food mills. Ditto with Maganrega program, where jobs are allocated to ghost workers and panchayat leaders. Surjit Balla writes that together, the black income generated by these two programs is over 1% of our GDP. That is close to 1,75,000 crores, helped by technology and Aadhaar. Then what we saw? We saw DBT, direct benefit transfer, where the cash goes directly into the bank accounts of beneficiaries, thereby eliminating middlemen and preventing leakages. Surjit Balla writes that this DBT scheme has gathered considerable momentum over the last few years. And he writes that the logical expansion of DBT is the policy of universal basic income, a guaranteed minimum income to all. But Mr. Balla seems to consider only the costs of these schemes, not the benefits. But more on that a bit later. Another important point. UBI scheme can be designed to grow in line with the wealth of the economy. We talked about automation. Automation is bound to increase profits, right? Because machines that make human labor redundant. We don't need human labor because we have machines. These machines would require no wages, only minimal investment for maintenance. So why not share these profits with the people? Automation. Another very important point. Today there are at least 1,000 schemes that the central government runs for the poor. It is not clear that the money actually reaches the poor. So the question is whether UBI is more effective way of reaching the poor than the current schemes that government employs. We have historically focused on individuals, but these individuals who are poor by virtue of their birth, they are Dalits, Adivasis, etc., etc. But what is happening now is that the accident of birth has become less important than the accident of life. People fall into poverty due to reasons like drought, declining opportunities in agriculture, diseases, and so on. So the safety net that is provided by the government should be wide, and that is why UBI has some merit, because it does not exclude anybody. Accident of birth is important, but now because of this accident of life, we need a wide security net. UBI is presented as a way of rectifying the current imbalance of social spending across districts. What does that mean? That means the poorest districts of this country, their share of social spending is typically less than their share of poverty. That means based on their poverty share, they should have spent more, but they are not, and hence continue to remain poor. That means there is a mismatch. And to resolve this mismatch, we need a universal basic income. There are politicians with sharp survival instincts. They have understood that global capitalism may have reached a stage where productivity will be driven largely by automation. A lot of surplus labor may actually need not have work. People may not need to work. And if high technology driven productivity, if this high technology driven productivity can generate big surpluses, why not share that with the people at large? That's the logic. But there is also another case in favor of universal basic income, and that is what we call ethical case. The ethical case for UBI is different. Its source is the idea, and this idea can be found both in Bible as well as in classical economics. The idea is that work is a curse, or as economists will put it, this work is a cost. Cost undertaken only for the sake of making a living. I work for money because I have to feed my family. As technological innovation causes per capita income to rise, people will need to work less to satisfy their needs. If you look at John Stuart Mill or Keynes, George Bernard Keynes, they both looked forward to a horizon of growing leisure. There's a very beautiful case. Reorientation of life away from merely useful to something which is beautiful and true. If my income is taken care of, I would indulge in art, painting, fiction. That means I'll make a productive use of my life, because work for the sake of sustenance is a curse. So why not provide universal basic income so that people can work for something meaningful? UBI provides a practical path to navigate this transition. So these were some of the arguments in favor of universal basic income. Arguments such as social justice, arguments such as poverty reduction, agency, rise in automation, rise in profits, and let's share these profits, and the ethical case, which is there in classical economics and also in Bible. Work is curse. So if the state is providing money to the people, they can make creative use of their talent, of their abilities. But now let's look at the case against universal basic income. The arguments against universal basic income. There was a poster during Swiss referendum. This poster asked, what would you do if your income were taken care of? The objection of most UBI opponents is that majority of the people would respond, nothing at all. The first argument, from an economic point of view, there are three principal and related objections to a universal basic income. Let's look at all these arguments one by one. The first is whether UBI reduces the incentive to work. People may not work. If they are guaranteed an unconditional income by the state, there is a paradox. We began this lecture with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi talked about poor, wiping every tear from every eye. Now here Mahatma Gandhi is talking about something else. What's that? He says, my ahimsa would not tolerate the idea of giving a free meal to a healthy person who has not worked for it. Mahatma Gandhi says, if I had the power, I would stop every Sadavarta where free meals are given. Mahatma Gandhi writes, it has degraded the nation. It has encouraged laziness, idleness, hypocrisy, and even crime. Such misplaced charity adds nothing to the wealth of the country, whether material or spiritual. Mahatma Gandhi writes, how nice and wise it would be if the donor were to open institutions where they would provide healthy meals under healthy, clean surroundings, but only to those men and women who would work. Only the rule should be no labor, no work. Fair enough? Well, I don't think so. This argument degrades the human dignity. You're assuming that people work out of necessity. And if this necessity is taken care of, there would be no incentive for people to work. This is the same argument that was used when the question of increase in minimum wages was raised. The argument was, if you increase the minimum wages, workers will choose leisure over work. Since that didn't happen, let's not jump the gun by saying universal basic income. Once it is in place, people won't work. So the first argument against UBI is taken care of. The argument is, it reduces the incentive to work. Let's look at the second concern. Should income be detached from employment? Why would we pay to those who don't work? The honest economic answer to this concern is that society already does this, but largely for the rich and privileged. I inherit a fortune from my parents and I don't work. A society which allows inheritance should have no problem with the mechanism of detaching employment from income. So this argument is not valid. Let's look at the third argument, reciprocity. We say that society is a scheme of social cooperation. Right? Should income, if this society is indeed a scheme of social cooperation, should income be unconditional with no regard to people's contribution to society? People might ask, why should state provide unconditional income to, let's say, JNU students, some of whom talk about dismembering this country? But what about our mothers? They work hard day in and day out in homes and kitchens, and their contribution is always neglected, never honored. Their contribution even doesn't figure in our GDP numbers. Such individuals who have been contributing to our society now deserve a recognition. Recognition of a right to unconditional income. That is UBI. There is one more. The argument against basic income is that poor will use the money to fund personally or socially detrimental activities, such as gambling, alcohol consumption. These are what we call temptation goods. But we have had experiences with cash transfers in a range of countries. For example, Ecuador, similarly Uganda. When we have conducted studies in these countries, even Mexico, for example, India, for example, these studies have not provided much evidence of such misuse. In general, the cash is spent on worthwhile goods and services. Please stay with me for a while and I will give you an Indian example to this. These were some of the arguments against the very idea of a universal basic income. But let's look at something else. This is very interesting. We in India have a lot of social welfare programs. But these programs, which should benefit the poor, instead benefit the rich as well. Or should I dare say, benefit rich more than poor. For example, LPG subsidy. Although there is a scheme wherein you can give up your LPG subsidy, but still LPG subsidy benefit the rich as well. Subsidies on diesel. And many subsidies which we refer to as non-merit subsidies. For example, railway tickets for AC 1 tier, 2 tier, 3 tier. Similarly, subsidies for ATF, aviation turbine fuel. Who benefits from these? Rich and the middle class? Such subsidies must end. The problem does not end here. Many of the intended recipients miss out. How? Testing. Testing or identification can be very difficult in an environment where jobs are concentrated not in the formal sector but in the informal sector, primarily in self-employment, without any formal account keeping or income data. Under these circumstances, identifying the poor can be costly, corrupt, complicated, as well as controversial. And this is true for India. An unconditional basic income could eliminate much of this mess because you don't have to identify the people. The people are already identified. The question is whether the governments can afford it without increasing the burden on taxpayers and undermining economic incentives. In India, the answer could be yes. If each of India's 1.25 billion people, they receive an annual basic income of, let's say, 12,000 rupees per year, That means 1000 rupee per month. It comes to about 10% of our GDP. There was a study conducted by National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. If 1.25 billion people, everyone is paid 12,000 rupees per year, the cost for the state would be 10% of the GDP. This New Delhi-based institute says that the government is spending even more than this. But how? Through implicit or explicit subsidies. These subsidies, which are for better off sections of the population. For example, we have tax exemptions for the corporate sector. By discontinuing some or all of these subsidies, but which of course do not include expenditure in areas such as health, education, nutrition, rural and urban development programs, and environmental protection. The government, if it cuts all the other inefficient subsidies, the government could be in a position to secure the funds to offer everyone, rich and poor, a reasonable basic income. If the government lacks the political courage to eliminate enough subsidies, two options remain. Either it could take steps to boost tax revenues, such as by improving property tax collections. What are we talking about? Arguments in favor of universal basic income. We talked about arguments against universal basic income. Now we are talking about, is it possible for a country like India to implement a universal basic income? There are experts who say yes. Why? There are meaningless subsidies that the state currently offers. Eliminate them. But do not touch the subsidies on health, education, nutrition, rural, urban development. Don't touch them. Instead, these wasteful subsidies you can eradicate. But if you cannot eradicate these wasteful subsidies, there are two options available for the government. The government can either boost tax revenues, such as by improving property tax collections, which are currently extremely low for that matter, or it can reduce the level of basic income that it introduces. But what governments should not do is fund a basic income scheme with the money from other key social welfare programs. That means don't scrap all social welfare schemes and introduce a universal basic income. While a basic income can replace some dysfunctional welfare schemes, it cannot substitute for, let's say, public education, healthcare, preschool nutrition programs, or employment guarantees in public works. After all, basic income would be still severely limited because there is no way to ensure that individuals would allocate enough of it to achieve socially desirable education, health, or nutrition levels. How can we ensure that people will spend money on education, health, nutrition? That means we need UBI, yes, but not as a substitute to these important social welfare schemes, but as an add-on. UBI should not replace the existing PDS. Let's not forget, India's ranking on Human Development Index is an abysmal 131. Let's look at the global picture. Year 2016, universal basic income was a hot topic at World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. The topic of discussion was World Without Work. In January, Finland launched a pilot program to give 560 euros to 2,000 unemployed individuals. It was a pilot program. They will not lose the income even if they find a job. We have Canada's Ontario. There is also a pilot program going on. Recently at a conference in Dubai, Tesla CEO Elon Musk said, autonomous technology will lead to high levels of unemployment. And therefore, some form of UBI is going to be necessary. Similar views were echoed by eBay co-founder, and this eBay co-founder is testing universal basic income in Kenya. And there are various pilot programs which are launched, for example, in Oakland, in California. There are many such pilot programs going on currently in the world. What about India? We have an Indian experiment as well. Let us talk about this Indian experiment. A pilot study was conducted in 8 villages of Madhya Pradesh. 8 villages in Madhya Pradesh provided over 6,000 individuals a monthly payment. First it was 100 for a child, 200 for an adult. Later it was raised 150 for a child and 300 for an adult. That means in 8 villages of Madhya Pradesh, 6,000 individuals were chosen and ultimately an assured annual income was provided to them. The money was paid out in cash. Transfer was unconditional, but the results were intriguing. Most villagers used this money on household improvements, latrines, walls, roofs, and this was while taking precautions against malaria. 24.3% of the household changed their source of energy for cooking or lighting. Similarly, 16% had made changes to their toilet. There was a seeming shift towards markets. Instead of going to the ration shops, people went directly to the markets, and this led to improved nutrition, particularly amongst SC and ST households. School attendance was better, performance was better, there was an increase in small-scale savings. There was an increase in small-scale investments, better seeds, saving machines, equipment rebates, etc., etc., etc. But most importantly, bonded labor decreased. Casual labor increased, self-employed farming and business activity increased, financial inclusion was rapid. Within 4 months of this pilot program, 95.6% of these individuals had bank accounts. Within a year, 73% households reported a reduction in their debt. There was no evidence of any increase in spending on alcohol. This was the Indian experiment. Before moving ahead, we would need more data to prove its applicability in Indian context. There have only been 8 large-scale pilot programs testing the impact of universal basic income on human well-being. Social context too matters. What I'm trying to say is what may have worked in Kenya or what may have worked in Manitoba might not necessarily work in India, might not necessarily be applicable to India. We need a greater depth of pilot studies. With more pilot programs that are planned, as I said, in Auckland, also in Netherlands, also in Germany, in India as well. Insights developed from these can be used to modify our welfare policy. A regular, unconditional basic income, which is scaled up through these pilot programs and rolled out slowly and carefully, seems ideal for India. It can help improve living conditions, including sanitation in our villages, providing them with access to better drinking water while improving children's nutrition. Regular basic income payments can help institute rational responses to illness or hunger, which will enable households to fund their health expenses instead of encountering vicious cycle of debt. My daughter is unwell. I have no money. What is the option? Or what is the only option available for me? Borrowing. Borrowing from whom? Friends or money lenders. Because in most cases, poor are deprived of credit by the banks because of the absence of collateral. It can help reduce child labor while facilitating an increase in school spending. It can transform villages, enabling the growth of productive work, and which ultimately will lead to a sustained increase in income. It could cut inequality, grow the economy, and at the same time offering pursuit of happiness. But let's go back to economic survey and let's look at this very importantly. The survey does not advocate a specific plan for UBI in India. No. Rather, it explains the idea. It explores various options and concludes that UBI, if not ripe for implementation, is ripe for serious discussion. Very good. That means economic survey is not advocating the implementation of UBI. It's only talking about, let's discuss universal basic income. But there is certainly a tone of enthusiasm in the chapter on UBI. What the survey discusses is not really UBI, but what might be called QUIT, quasi-universal income top-up. universal basic income would be for everybody, right from Ambanis and Tatas to the poor people of this country. This sort of UBI is not advocated by Economic Survey. And this is what an eminent development economist, John Draves, talks about. QUIT, Quasi-Universal Income Top-Up. Let me explain. It is an essential part of principle of UBI that the transfers involved, the money that the state is transferring, should cover the basic costs of subsistence, food, education, health, etc., etc. That is why the term used is basic. That means whatever money, whatever income is transferred to the beneficiary by the state, this should meet the basic requirements of life. Food, education, health. That is why the term used is basic income. If UBI provides less than that, it is not basic. It is partial basic income. In this case, what Economic Survey is talking about, it is talking about only a tiny per capita income transfer, which is even below than Tendulkar poverty line. So that is why we cannot say it's a basic income. We can say it's an income top-up. Income top-up would be more accurate. Also, it is not universal. As I said, universal basic income. Universal, that means this income is for everybody. Basic, that means this income must meet the basic requirements of life for the people. Since it is not basic, because even less than Tendulkar poverty line, the Economic Survey is proposing, which is close to 12,000 rupees per year. Since it is not basic, it is not even universal. In fact, Economic Survey talks about 75% of the people. We should have a universal basic income for 75% of the people. Surjit Balla, on the other hand, talks about universal basic income, but only for the lowest 50% people. So it is neither universal nor is it basic. So what we can talk about? We can talk about QUIT, Quasi-Universal Income Top-Up. That means UBI in India would be neither universal nor basic. But further, Surjit Balla, when we discussed him in the beginning of this lecture, he talked about PDS, he talked about Maganrega schemes, and he says that these schemes should be eliminated and ultimately the money that we will save should be used to fund a basic income for the bottom 50% of our population. But why demean some of the very fine, if not perfect schemes that are currently working? Why demean in-kind transfers and opt only for in-cash transfers? Midday meals, for example, they are excellent in-kind transfers, but they are also a constructive activity with valuable aims. What is the aim of midday meals? Nutrition, education, employment generation, social equity. Similarly, for Maganrega, Maganrega is not a scheme of in-kind transfers. In fact, the wages are paid out in cash. But apart from income support, it serves other useful purposes as well, such as asset creation, women's empowerment, environmental protection. During the last 15 years or so, India has developed a semblance of social security framework. Apart from essential health and education services, this framework has 5 pillars. 1. Employment generation in rural areas, public distribution system, integrated child development services, social security pensions, maternity entitlements. Far from being wasteful, these programs have played a critical role in protecting people from deprivation, and they have also helped create a better society. This framework needs to be consolidated, not demolished, not dismantled. For instance, we can universalize maternity entitlements. After all, it's a legal right of all women since 2013 under National Food Security Act. This is not to say that there are no wasteful schemes currently on offer. This is not to dismiss the idea of universal basic income. But all we are trying to say is, even if we will eradicate these wasteful schemes and programs, the fiscal space that will be available to us is not sufficient enough. That means fiscal space which will be available to us by pruning wasteful schemes and subsidies, is very restricted, and it is not enough for UBI to be implemented. That means the money that can be saved from dismantling the existing wasteful schemes is insufficient to fund a universal basic income. And UBI, if and when desirable, must be planned as an extension or modification of the existing framework, not as an alternative to it. Universal basic income is an idea whose time will come, but that time is still quite distant as far as India is concerned. Let us look at this paragraph very importantly. Some social scientists even suggest that a society which generates huge productivity and prosperity from what? From automation. They can envisage, they can view a future which is characterized by the Marxist utopia. What was Marxist utopia? That there should be a post-capitalist stage where leisure time of labor is totally freed and an enlightened population is largely engaged in its own creative pursuits. Ultimately, what Marx is talking about, we may enter into a post-capitalist world where people will spend their time and energy in creative pursuits rather than work. While advanced capitalist societies may be able to dream of such a future for themselves, India is still a very poor country and possibly several decades away from achieving a middle to high per capita income of, let's say, $15,000 to $20,000 annually. So universal basic income in countries of Europe or Japan will have a totally different meaning because these societies have taken for granted things such as universal healthcare, education, housing, which in India will take decades to achieve. Our policy makers are still grappling with executing universal food and nutrition security. Can the government abdicate its responsibility to deliver basic welfare by simply putting cash in the bank accounts of the poor? Is UBI a substitute for free education, primary healthcare infrastructure provided by the state? This is the key question which cannot be wished away. We talked about universal basic income. We began with Switzerland where it was rejected. Then we talked about arguments in favor. We talked about arguments against universal basic income. We talked about the global picture. We talked about the Indian experiment in Madhya Pradesh. But then we are talking about in pessimism. That yes, universal basic income is required, but the time is not right for India. Because ultimately what the government will do, they will eliminate, dismantle all the subsidy schemes, all these beautiful programs such as PDS, Maganrega, and ultimately will replace these schemes with universal basic income. That should not happen. Yes, UBI is a beautiful idea and ought to be implemented in India. But should UBI replace all existing social security schemes? No. Should wasteful schemes be eradicated? Yes. Should UBI be fixed and unalterable? No. UBI must be aligned with the inflation rate as well. As the inflation rises, so should UBI. But this is very risky as well. Tomorrow, populist politics will dominate. The cry of all political parties in order to win the election would be, we will raise UBI. We will raise UBI to a level which will not be fiscally viable. Should more and more pilot studies be conducted before embarking on the implementation of universal basic income? Yes. Should there be broad political consensus on this whole new idea? Yes. We need UBI, yes. But are we ready for it? Perhaps no. Thank you for watching.